So, Warhammer Fantasy is coming back, and not in the way that I would have thought. Warhammer the Old World is a return to the world that was, the Old World as they call it, but set a few hundred years in the past. Games Workshop is committed to the fact that the Old World definitely died, and there's nothing we can do to change that. So, given the fact that there is no actual future of Warhammer Fantasy, I think it's interesting that Games Workshop chose to go back in time. The Time of the Three Emperors is, I think, an interesting compromise that allows fans to have a very familiar Warhammer Fantasy setting, but with some shakeups that would come from going back that far away. When the Old World actually comes out, I might actually make a couple of Mathhammer videos that I've done previously, but the subject for today's video is about the past. I'm talking the distant past, and I'm not talking about the 1980s. What the Old World demonstrates to me is that Games Workshop are perfectly content to jump back in time to give people what they want, which is Warhammer Fantasy. Plenty of people pine for the setting to return in some official capacity, but while I don't think Age of Sigmar is necessarily a bad setting, I think I understand why people want Warhammer Fantasy to come back. I think part of the reason for all of this interest in the old world is, of course, nostalgia, right? Nostalgia for the world, both literally and figuratively, that was, and possibly an opportunity to dust off all your models and play Warhammer again like it's the 90s. But I don't necessarily think that Games Workshop are using the concept enough, right? I don't necessarily believe that Games Workshop actually used Warhammer Fantasy setting to its full potential. So I think that all the time traveling that Games Workshop is doing could be taken further. So in this video, I'm going to put forward an idea that I have called Warhammer Fantasy Ancients.
Baby, don't you know it? I'm hardly heroic. Baby, let's roll it, 'cause I'm hardly heroic.
The Warhammer Fantasy setting is one that is as huge and rich as our own in-world history. According to the Imperial calendar, the Empire itself, which is quite possibly the most important human nation, at least if you're excluding Cathay, is only, however, about 2,500 years old. The actual history of the world is several times that number. And yet, despite this history, we still don't really know much about it. If you read something like, say, for example, the Tomb King's lore, you'd probably get a more sense of what the world was like before the rise of Sigmar and the foundation of the Empire. But that's not necessarily a lot. And even then, there's further information before that that is also excluded. A lot of people, myself included, have pointed out that Warhammer borrows a lot from real-world history. Yet, one of the more interesting deviations from real-world history is that the ancient era of Warhammer is largely dominated by the Egyptian-themed Neherkaran civilization. Unlike in our real world, where antiquity is for the most part dominated by the Mediterranean, the first of the great human civilizations is the Neherkaran one, and it stays that way, largely until it collapses, and even then, only a relatively short time later, Sigmar rises and founds the Empire. There's a lot of room in the Warhammer Fantasy timeline, and here's where I think I can talk about the subject of the actual video. So, what is Warhammer Fantasy Ancients? Well, it's basically what it says on the tip. It's Warhammer Fantasy, but set in the distant past of the Warhammer timeline. Before Sigmar, before the Empire, and into a large part of the Warhammer world that we haven't really explored before. This, I think, is a great way to create something really new and fresh in the context of Warhammer Fantasy, to go beyond simply just replaying to nostalgia's sake. The High Elves, the Dark Elves, Lizardmen, Chaos, Dwarves, Orcs and Goblins, and even the Skaven all exist for thousands of years before the main setting. Sure, they wouldn't necessarily be the same. Gunpowder, for example, was only invented by the dwarves 400 odd years before Sigmar founds the Empire, but, importantly, for the most part, I think many of the factions that we have are still in some recognizable form. After all, the elves have been fighting with spearmen and archers for basically their entire existence. Skaven will always have hordes of rats that they can throw at anyone that opposes them. I think this would be an opportunity to be actually creative with the Warhammer Fantasy factions, by imagining what they would have been like before the thousands of years of historical calcification has occurred, to go back to when some of these civilizations might have been at their height, rather than their slowly diminishing end. For other factions, I think this means complete reinvention. The Empire of Bretonnia wouldn't exist, and you'd have to have other human factions that take place in the world. You could have, for example, the ancient Neherkaran army, and then armies made out of early human tribes, depending on exactly when you wanted to set it. I could easily see an argument for allowing these armies of ancient Neherkara, as well as maybe early forms of the vampire counts and mortuary cults. After all, the Tomb Kings weren't spawned completely on their own, whole cloth. Games Workshop could explore the lore of the early human settlements in the Old World. We have inklings of what they might have been like, ancient human civilizations in the era before history officially starts, so to speak. I think this would be a perfect opportunity to add to that by expanding those concepts into actual factions. And then of course you can compete them against the Neherkaran Empire to the south. I think there's a lot of room to explore there. Warhammer 40k has always had the Horus Heresy as its founding mythology. Over the years, the Horus Heresy has grown in scope and complexity to encompass this massive war of mythological proportions. Gods and kings, demons and devils, all of it encompassed in the shadow of Horus's betrayal of the Emperor. Its shadow looms over the Imperium, and its implications are still felt 10,000 years later. Warhammer Fantasy has never really had that. I think one reason is because Warhammer 40k has always been the story of the Imperium. Even the War in Heaven, one of the most destructive wars in the history of the galaxy, is still a footnote in comparison to the Horus Heresy. Warhammer Fantasy is, however, not only the story of the Empire. One important mythological moment is for sure the founding of the Empire, but thousands of years before that, the High Elves and the Lizardmen fought to save the entire planet from the most significant Chaos invasion in its entire history. This, I think, is one of the most epic stories of the entire setting, but it's very rarely brought up in the wider context of the world. There are several points in the history of the Warhammer world that could be considered its mythological origin, depending of course who you ask, which is why something like Warhammer Fantasy Ancients could be a great idea. We could start with one point, say the era of the Neherkaran Empire, and then release expansions for other mythological points, like the founding of the Empire by Sigmar, the salvation of the world by the High Elves, or perhaps even the War of the Beard. I could go on, but you get my point. I am under no illusion, of course, that Games Workshop would actively push for something like this under their own power. I don't think we're really in the era of them trying to really push the boundaries of their own IP. But hey, the fans are the ones who've really been carrying the torch for Warhammer Fantasy all this time. The War Master Revolutions project is built on the back of fan interest. Until Games Workshop threatened them with legal action, the Warhammer Armies project was one of the best places to find army books for all of the Warhammer armies that we wish we could have had. I've certainly got some ideas for what the rules of this hypothetical Warhammer Fantasy Ancients game might look like. Maybe you do too. And so that's the video. I hope that you've enjoyed it. Let me know what you think of it in the comments, like and subscribe and all of that. Until next time, take care and farewell.